I used to think the coldest thing I'd ever feel was an Aspen winter. I was wrong. The coldest thing is being shoved out of your own home on Christmas night by your own father. My name is Madison Grace Carter, and last Christmas, everything I thought I knew about family shattered in a single moment. During our televised gala, my grandfather, Silas, accidentally bumped a priceless antique Gregory didn't check if he was hurt. He looked at the cameras and snarled that we were brand liabilities and trash. He shoved Silas's wheelchair into the freezing blizzard and slammed the door. We were out. Have you ever felt like a brand liability to your own family? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who is part of our community tonight. The door clicked shut with a finality that should have broken me, but it didn't. I didn't pound on the wood or scream for a father who had already traded his soul for a stock price. I am an architect by trade and by nature, and I deal in structural integrity. Tonight, the structure of the Carter family didn't just crack. It dissolved into the frozen air, leaving nothing but the raw, jagged truth of who my father really was. I turned the wheelchair around and began the slow, grueling trek toward my studio apartment on Pearl Street. The wind was a serrated blade, cutting through my thin coat and threatening to steal the very breath from my lungs. But I didn't feel the bite. Anger, I discovered, is a high-octane fuel that burns hotter and cleaner than any Colorado hearth. I pushed Silas 4 blocks through the mounting snow, the wheels of his chair groaning against the icy slush. My studio was a small, cramped box on the top floor of a building that had seen better decades, but it was honest. It smelled of wet wool, graphite, and old blueprints. As soon as we crossed the threshold, I didn't look for a blanket first. I looked for a barrier. I grabbed my heavy oak drafting table, the only piece of furniture I owned that actually possessed real weight, and I shoved it against the door. The sound of wood screaming against the floorboards was the only Christmas carol I needed. I was barring the entrance to our sanctuary with the very tool I used to build a life Gregory knew nothing about. I sat at my laptop, my fingers blue and stiff from the cold, but my mind was a clinical white space. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask why. I just opened the account portals and started clicking cancel. I canceled the $500 weekly floral arrangement delivery for the mansion. I canceled the $2,000 monthly payment for Jennifer's personal trainer and the premium subscription to Gregory's private aviation club. For 3 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a perfect family, footing the bill for the optics, while I worked triple shifts at the diner and stocked shelves at midnight. They weren't shocked by what they had done to me. They were going to be shocked that I had finally stopped playing along with the charade. Now, I realized my life had been a subscription service to their ego, and I was officially unsubscribing. This was the brutal reality of the trap of cruel normalization. In Gregory's eyes, Silas wasn't a father and I wasn't a daughter. We were simply brand assets that had suddenly become liabilities in his latest marketing campaign. He had spent decades curating a televised image so meticulously that he'd actually convinced himself that anyone who didn't fit the frame was a defect to be removed from the inventory. It is a psychological cage where compassion is viewed as a luxury the company can no longer afford to keep on the books. He didn't see himself as shaming his own blood. He saw himself as discarding a prop that had stopped shining correctly under the gala lights. I looked over at the radiator. It gave 2 weak metallic clicks and died, leaving the room to the mercy of the Aspen winter. I draped every scrap of fabric I owned over Silas, my old sweaters, my towels, even the heavy velvet curtains, but his lips were still a haunting shade of blue. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, taking and taking until I was spiritually bankrupt. But as I watched the snow pile up against the window, I felt a strange, icy clarity settle over me. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And the Carters were about to find out just how much they owed to the people they had thrown into the cold. I sat on the cold floor of my studio, my back braced against the heavy drafting table that served as the only barrier between us and the howling Aspen wind. I watched Silas breathe, a thin mechanical sound that cost me $15,000 every single month just to maintain. 3 years ago, when the medical bills first started piling up, Gregory had looked me in the eye and told me he was restructuring his emotional portfolio and couldn't spare a cent for his own father's survival. He claimed a liquidity crisis, while Jennifer's closet filled with enough designer leather to fund a small hospital. I didn't argue then, and I didn't cry tonight. I simply reviewed the ledgers of my own life. I have spent every day of my 20s as the silent investor in the Carter family's facade. I worked the 5 a.m. shift at the diner, smelling like cheap grease and artificial smiles just to cover the cost of Silas's physical therapy. From one pen to six, I worked as a junior architect, designing sustainable systems for people who would never know my name. And from 7 until midnight, I stocked shelves at the supermarket, the plastic crates cutting into my palms until they bled. Every dollar, every cent was funneled into keeping Silas alive in a world that my father had convinced him was empty. I was the builder, the one maintaining the structural integrity of a man's life while the supposed CEO was busy looting the remains of the family soul. Silas reached out, his hand catching mine. His grip, usually a frail tremor, was suddenly a vice, cold, steady, and filled with a resonance that startled me. "Madison," he whispered, his voice losing the ragged edge of a victim. "You've been the sentinel. I watched you break your back to carry a weight that was never yours to bear." This was the silent regret of the sentinel. For years, Silas had been a watcher from his wheelchair, trapped in a cage of his own making. He had stayed silent while Gregory cannibalized the original firm, not out of weakness, but as a high-stakes test of character. He needed to be sure I wasn't just another prop in Gregory's optics-driven world. He was waiting for me to become a builder, someone who understood that a legacy isn't built on the shine of a brand, but on the strength of the person holding the bricks. He had carried the guilt of every morning I woke up exhausted and every night I went to bed hungry. But he knew that if he handed me the keys too early, the vultures Gregory hired would have picked us both clean. The car crash that put me in this chair wasn't an accident. "Madison," he said, his eyes turning to a shade of blue colder than the storm outside. Gregory thought he had liquidated my influence under that wreckage. He thought he could evict the founder and take the throne. He pulled a small silver key from a chain around his neck, something he had kept hidden beneath his blanket for years. "I never lost the money, Madison. I just moved it." I built a new empire under different names and shell companies while Gregory was busy playing with the scraps I left him. He leaned forward, his face a map of hidden power. "The portfolio is worth $4,600,000,000 and includes 218 high-value properties, and it is no longer mine. It is yours." I didn't feel a rush of joy. I felt a clinical sense of completion. My father had discarded us like trash, but he hadn't realized that trash could be refined into a weapon. This wasn't a gift, it was a transfer of assets. And the audit was just beginning. I helped Silas back into the passenger seat of my beat-up sedan, carefully buckling the blanket around his legs before stowing his wheelchair in the trunk. The studio apartment behind us was a cold, empty box, but I didn't look back. I put the car in gear and followed Silas's quiet instructions, navigating through the winding, snow-clogged roads of Aspen. We climbed higher into the hills, leaving the tourist-packed center and the flashing lights of the holiday gentry behind. The air grew thinner and the houses grew sparser, until the trees opened up to reveal a set of black iron gates that seemed to hold back the weight of the mountain itself. They were carved with intricate, heraldic patterns that Gregory's modern glass and steel aesthetic would have found primitive. I slowed the car, my heart a steady, clinical thrum. Before I could reach for the intercom, the gates swung open with a silent, mechanical grace. 2 guards in charcoal uniforms stepped out from a stone gatehouse. In Gregory's world, guards were hired muscle designed to intimidate. These men didn't just stand, they stood at attention. As we drove past, they didn't ask for a pass or a name. They removed their caps and bowed so deeply their heads aligned with the snow. One of them spoke into a lapel mic, his voice carrying through the winter, quiet. "The master has returned. Open the inner courtyard." Madison Grace Carter was an architect of structures, but as I looked at Silas in the passenger seat, I realized I had been blind to the most significant structure of all, the one he had built in total silence, while the world assumed he was a broken man. The path was lined with marble statues that held glowing lanterns against the gathering twilight, their light reflecting off fountains that sprayed liquid diamonds into the air. At the end of the drive stood an estate so vast, it looked like it belonged to a different century. It was a fortress of white stone and red-tiled roofs, gleaming with the kind of permanence Gregory's brand could never buy. The front doors burst open, and a woman in a severe, elegant black uniform rushed out. She didn't wait for us to reach her. She dropped to her knees in the light snow as I helped Silas out of the car. "Master Silas, you are back," she whispered, her voice cracking with a devotion that blood alone could never produce. Silas looked at her with a tired, regal familiarity and simply nodded. He led me into a massive office that smelled of pine wood, aged leather, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of old power. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked rolling, snow-covered hills and a private lake that didn't appear on any municipal map I had ever studied. Silas pointed to a mahogany desk the size of a boardroom table. "Sit, Madison," he said, his voice as steady as the stone walls around us. He slid a heavy leather portfolio across the desk. Inside were the deeds to property districts in Florida, high-rise apartments in Seattle, and vast timberlands in Montana. "The Carter name Gregory carries is an empty shell," Silas said, his eyes glassy but resolute. "This is the real portfolio. It is worth $4,600,000,000 and includes 218 high-value properties." I looked at the notarized documents, seeing my own name, Madison Grace Carter, printed as the sole heir and current controller of the trust. I didn't feel a rush of greed or a surge of joy. I felt a cold, professional sense of readiness. Gregory had spent 20 years calling this man a parasite while living in a house he didn't realize was owned by a ghost. Now, the ghost had handed me the keys. I was no longer the daughter thrown into the snow. I was the landlord of my father's entire life. I sat in the mahogany study of the estate, but my hands weren't resting on the velvet armrests. They were on my phone. I didn't answer a single one of the 43 missed calls from my father, or the 19 frantic texts from Jennifer. I went back to my spreadsheet. My compassion had been a luxury Gregory had overdrafted for decades, but the account was now permanently closed. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon a single ounce of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I picked up the landline and dialed a number I had kept in my contacts for years. Marcus Graves, a childhood friend who was now a federal prosecutor, answered on the second ring. I didn't open with a greeting. I opened with a transaction. I told him I was sitting on 20 years of corporate sabotage, wire fraud, and systemic embezzlement. I didn't ask for a favor. I offered him the biggest case of his career. Gregory, true to his nature, didn't choose honesty. He chose optics. 2 days later, he went live on the Carter Holdings public channel, a video that was picked up by every major news outlet in Colorado. He stood in front of a digital backdrop of the Aspen Mountains, looking every bit the grieving, responsible CEO. He told the world that I had suffered a mental breakdown on Christmas night and that I was currently holding the founder captive in an attempt to extort the company. He called my actions a tragic side effect of professional failure and claimed I was being manipulated by Silas's declining mental state. I watched the video with clinical detachment. His panic was just a data point I had already factored into the timeline. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. He wasn't shocked by what he had done. He was shocked that I had stopped providing the credit for his lies. But while Gregory was busy performing for the stock market, Marcus was performing an autopsy on the Carter corporate records. He called me at 3 a.m. His voice, usually steady, was sharp with adrenaline. He had found the lethal discovery. 20 years ago, while Silas was still unconscious in a hospital bed following his accident, Gregory hadn't been praying for a recovery. He had been meeting with a corrupt notary. He had forged Silas's signature on an irrevocable power of attorney and a document of diminished capacity. He hadn't inherited the original firm. He had hijacked it through a felony. The USB drive Silas had given me confirmed it, with a precision that made my blood run cold. I heard Gregory's voice on a recording from 22 years ago, laughing with Jennifer about how easy it was to erase the old man's pen stroke. It was corporate murder, signed in ink that was now beginning to bleed. I stood by the window, watching the sunrise over the private lake, but I didn't feel the warmth. I felt the weight of the two folders on the desk, one with a fortune, one with the truth. Marcus told me the FBI was already preparing the warrants. The legal vice was closing, and every televised lie Gregory told was just another nail in his coffin. He thought he was protecting his brand, but he was actually documenting his own downfall. I turned off the monitor, the room falling into a heavy, purposeful silence. The audit was over. The execution was next. I arrived at the Carter mansion on New Year's Eve, the same driveway where Silas and I had been discarded like refuse into the storm just days earlier. The gala was in full swing, televised and glitzy, a sea of silk and hollow laughter designed to bury the corporate scandal Gregory had been desperately trying to suppress. I didn't hide. I walked through the front doors accompanied by 4 federal agents and Marcus Graves. Gregory saw me from the center of the room, a glass of $1,000 whiskey in his hand. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed that a brand liability had interrupted his carefully curated broadcast. He stepped toward me, his face flushing with the performative rage he had used to keep his family and his employees in line for decades. He told the cameras that I was a trespasser, a disturbed girl who had finally lost her mind. He shouted for security to remove the trash from his home. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply waited for the red light on the main camera to blink, ensuring the world was watching. I leaned in and spoke with a precision that was more lethal than any shout. I told him that he was confused about whose home this was. I pulled out the trust documents, notarized and stamped by the federal authorities. For 20 years, Gregory had bragged about the Carter estates, but he had never bothered to check the fine print of the shell companies Silas had built to protect the legacy he had truly founded. The mansion he stood in, the ground he walked on, and even the air he breathed were owned by a trust he had no legal claim to, a trust that Silas had transferred entirely into my name 48 hours ago. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. The whiskey glass Gregory had been gripping shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the room like a final verdict. He stared at the documents, his jaw trembling as the color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost in a tailored suit. I handed him a single white envelope. It was a formal eviction notice, effective immediately. I looked him dead in the eye, the same way he had looked at me when he shoved Silas's wheelchair into the blizzard. I told him that I was just taking the trash out. In that moment, I witnessed the total collapse of Gregory Carter. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. My father had spent his entire adult life believing that his worth was measured by the square footage of his house, the brand of his watch, and the fear he could inspire in his inventory of people. He had confused having things with being someone. His identity was a hollow structure built on a foundation of stolen assets and performative greed. The second his ownership was stripped away, his personality evaporated. Without the mansion to shield him and the company to inflate him, he was just a terrified man who realized he had nothing left to stand on. His power wasn't internal. It was a rental he had just defaulted on. Gregory sank to his knees in the middle of the gala as the federal agents stepped forward to serve the criminal warrants for the forgery and fraud Marcus had uncovered. Jennifer stood nearby, her face frozen in horror as she realized the jewelry and the silk were now assets being seized in a federal investigation. They weren't just losing a house, they were losing the only version of themselves they had ever known. I didn't feel triumph as I watched them being led away in front of their own cameras. I felt the same cold clarity I had felt in the studio. The audit was final. The debts were settled. And for the first time in my life, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a legacy. The legal process that followed the New Year's Eve eviction was as methodical and absolute as a final audit. Gregory was found guilty on all counts, including corporate sabotage, wire fraud, and the forgery of Silas's medical records. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for at least 15 years. Jennifer received a sentence of 2 years for her role as an accomplice. They had spent their entire lives performing a version of family that didn't exist, and in the end, the cameras they loved so much only recorded their total collapse. They moved from a chandelier-filled mansion to a 6-by-9 cell, finally understanding that their power was never theirs to keep. Silas lived to see the verdict. He spent his final weeks in the sun, watching the morning light hit the private lake from his favorite bench in the rose garden. He passed gently on a Tuesday morning, a faint smile on his lips and a sense of peace that had been missing for 20 years. His last words to me were a reminder that I was no longer defined by the cold, but by the heart I used to build a way out of it. He was a man who lived through betrayal, rebuilt an empire from the ashes, and finally rested, knowing his legacy was in the hands of the only person who loved him for who he was. I took over the trust and immediately restructured the empire as the Carter Legacy Group. The first policy I implemented was strict ethics training and the immediate termination of any executive who valued optics over integrity. I established the Silas Carter Honor Scholarship, providing full funding for students from broken homes who work multiple jobs just to survive, the way I once did. I didn't want to just be rich. I wanted to be responsible for the kind of world Silas believed was possible. On the anniversary of his passing, I stood on the stage of the new foundation building and looked out at hundreds of young people. I told them that last Christmas, I was thrown into the snow because someone thought money defined worth. I told them they were wrong. This is my letter to those who have spent their lives on the edge, feeling like the invisible one or the brand liability. To those of you who have been discarded because you were too dramatic or not enough for the family image, listen to me. The cold doesn't define you. It refines you. You are not trash and you are not inventory. You are the builders of the future. If you keep your dignity and your kindness, you will never be empty-handed. You can rebuild everything, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of the strength of your own heart. My grandfather believed in second chances, and this empire is his second chance living on through every one of you. That night, as I walked through the rose garden with my husband Ethan and our son Henry, I felt Silas beside me in every breath of the winter air. The roses were the deepest red I had ever seen, and I knew that he was finally proud. Madison didn't just take the money. She took back her soul. If this story moved you, share it with someone who is currently feeling invisible. Subscribe to join our family of builders and tell me, what would you do with a $4,600,000,000 secret?